Sound is good? Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming to our talk today. We're going to talk about what to do when you have a great idea for a Drupal module. So how you can sort of, bring that to life, get it something that's going to be shared by the community. But before we get started, how about a show of hands? Who is here because they have a module idea that they're excited about and just want to get some tips in terms of how to get that created? Okay, I see a few of you. I got one myself, so definitely in the same company. So I am Martin Anderson-Clutz. I currently work at Acquia. I'm also have a segment on the Talking Drupal podcast. On sort of Drupal and social platforms, I go by ManClue, and these slides I did post to LinkedIn, Twitter, and Mastodon earlier today. So if you wanted to follow along or just access them afterwards, definitely lots of venues. I've also done a few certifications, including a variety around Drupal, and that'll come back up again later. So really, let's level set a little bit about this talk and what it's all about. So it's really about my own experience. So obviously, not all of these things will necessarily translate directly in terms of, achieving the same kinds of success. You may find that different things work better for you. It's really about deciding on what your module should do and why. It's not really sort of like a how to code certain things. There's a lot of resources linked in here, and so again, that's why the slides are probably going to be pretty useful. And this is as close as you're going to come to seeing any code in this presentation. So again, it's really not about coding. It's really more about process and then promotion in terms of getting your module out there. So what I would say is really it should all start with that big idea. What is the problem that you're trying to solve with your module? Maybe try and think about, is there a particular pain point or maybe a gap in terms of what Drupal can do? Is there a particular use case that you want Drupal to be able to meet that it can't today? So really try and think about and articulate what that is. The other thing you might want to think about is Jacob's Law. So Jacob Nielsen was a pioneer of UX, and particularly in the web space. And so Jacob's Law is really, anybody who comes to your website has already visited, thousands of sites on the internet. And so they have a bunch of mental models in terms of how things should work. And so it's great to be innovative, but to the extent that you can actually leverage some of their expectations in terms of how things should work, you're actually going to make your solution more intuitive. So as you're thinking about how you're going to make your solution work, try and think about, are there those existing mental models that you can potentially leverage to make things more intuitive? The other thing you might want to think about is, should your module be more of like a toolkit? So something like, views or CTools or, search API, some of these things that on their own don't necessarily, do a lot, but it's something for either like another, module developer to take and then build something cool with, or for a site builder to configure into something usable. Whereas a solution, I would say, is more of a, you can install it and then people can start using it right away. And neither of these is the right answer. You may want to do something that's more of that sort of developer toolkit. There may be cases where long-term you sort of ultimately want to provide both of those things. So maybe you want to start by having sort of a splashy front end, but then eventually have APIs for people to extend it. But probably when you start out, you're going to want to pick one or the other and build out from there kind of over the long term. So what I like to do next is to try and sort of build out a proof of concept. So rather than sitting down and trying to do a proof of concept that's like really ambitious and includes a lot of code, really try and distill down the core kernel of what your idea is. So as a very simple example, one of the first modules that I started working on for Drupal is called Search Overrides, which really provides a way to manipulate what results are going to appear at the top of search results. And I had come across a Solr property that I thought would work. I found it was like a Search API Solr hook that I could use to alter the query. And it ended up being like 10 lines of code to sort of try out this, property with this hook. Used hard-coded values. It took me like an hour. But at the end of that, I could validate that like this thing that I wanted to do would actually work. And so, trying to do something very simple as a way to just sort of like test the approach of what you want to do, to me, is a really great way to start. it allows you to sort of validate that the approach that you want is going to work, but it's also cool because then you can put it in front of people and say, like, here's this idea that I have, here's how it's going to work, and collect feedback. People may say, that sounds amazing, I've been wanting Drupal to be able to do this. They may say, oh, that sounds like this other module that I use all the time, right? And so it's a great way to sort of get that feedback, but to me, it's really motivating because, at this point, you start to feel like, hey, this is a thing that's actually viable. This is a thing that, I can start to invest more time and energy into because it has the potential to actually do what I'm excited about. I would say the next step then is to really start to do some research. So find out, are there existing modules that actually do either the same thing or something similar? The other thing that you may want to think about is maybe there's a library that can get you part of the way there. So a PHP library, it could be a JavaScript library, but it's a good time to sort of figure out what's existing already in that space. So definitely do some searches on Drupal.org, do some searches on Google, try and use like synonyms. Don't just be fixated on like particular words for what it is that you want to do. I've definitely been through the process of actually like kind of building out a whole module, and then like as I go to register the namespace is taken, and then I realized that the module that I literally had just built, somebody had already beat me to it. So spare yourself agony and do the research up front. The other thing that you may want to think about is it's possible that rather than this being a standalone module, what you want to achieve could be better done as like an add-on to an existing module. And so, if that's the case, open up an issue on that module, see if the maintainers respond in terms of like, are they open to a patch to provide this new issue or this new feature? Or maybe they might respond and say, that sounds interesting, but not something we want to maintain. So like try and do that as an add-on module. Maybe they would point you even to like an API or something. The other thing I sometimes find helpful is to think about like what's an analogous module. So not something that does exactly what I want to do, but maybe has some sort of like works in some parallel ways. So as an example, with that search overrides module that I talked about, I wanted to have sort of an admin way for people to go in and be able to sort of manage those different overrides. And so in my head, I was thinking it should kind of work like the way the redirect module works. And so by thinking of that analogy, now I could go into the redirect module and sort of see like what are the classes that it implements. And then that became sort of a good guide for me to say, okay, so this is how I define a custom entity, and these are sort of like the list classes and the form classes and some of those other things. So to me, that can be helpful from time to time as well. And then the last thing is, as you start to think about like namespaces, maybe check for an abandoned project, because there are a bunch of Drupal projects that have not been maintained in several years, and so they're really up for grabs. You can go in and sort of grab that namespace, and sometimes they're pretty sweet. Like I got the person namespace a couple of years ago. The next step is really to start to, plan out the work that you want to undertake. So, what are some of the functional elements that you think need to be built out? You might also start to think about like, is there like an MVP version that could sort of represent, the initial sort of like even stable release, and then, maybe the rest of it becomes sort of more of a long-term roadmap. Maybe you want to start to think about user stories so that you're less focused on like almost like code elements, but more like what's the user experience or the admin experience that you're trying to create. You might want to think about what elements you want to be configurable, but again, those don't necessarily have to be configurable out of the box. So you can start off with something that has some hard-coded assumptions, and then over time make more and more of the elements configurable. And again, start to think about, are there existing pieces of code that you can extend? So, there may be classes in core that you can extend and then just add a couple of new methods to sort of get the functionality that you need instead of having to write all of that code from scratch. And then finally, start to think about what are the things that you're going to need to store. So do I need to create any like config or content entities? Maybe for whatever reason you feel like you need to actually write directly to the database. I would say in modern Drupal that tends to be an exception rather than a rule, but this is a good stage to start thinking about what those strategies are going to look like. So at this point, you're probably ready to go in and actually start writing some code. Now, the good thing with Drupal is that, there's lots of great free tools, so you can install VS Code. There's a link here to the documentation on getting it all set up specifically to Drupal with like your code linters, Xdebug and all of those good things. Definitely code standards are important. So if you didn't catch XJM's session yesterday about code review, I would definitely try and watch the recording of that because, she does lay out a good case in terms of, if you're wanting people to give you feedback on your code and you've got a bunch of code standards errors, it's going to be harder for them to really focus on the functional elements that you actually want the feedback on. So definitely try and lint as you go. Same thing with writing automated tests. It's going to be easier while the code is top of mind to sort of remember what are the use cases that you were trying to anticipate with your code and then be able to test against those. There is even a concept of test-driven development. I feel like there's some controversy around that, so I'm not going to wade into that, but just be aware that that's a thing and maybe potentially an approach that you want to take. In terms of actually starting to build out your code, there are Drush generators that you can use, as well as for generating things like entities. There's a couple of videos that are linked here, and so if you're not familiar with those, then that can definitely sort of save you a lot of time in terms of that initial setup as well. But overall, I would say, particularly as you're actually writing your code, if you have the opportunity to get feedback as early and as often as you can, because it's definitely easier to course correct, as soon as possible, rather than putting a bunch of work in, putting it in front of somebody, and they go like, did you think about doing it this other one? You're like, oh yeah, I wish I had thought of that before I wrote, 400 lines of code. So when you get into a stumbling block, and probably you will, at least that's my experience, think about where are some good opportunities to get help. So definitely if there's a nearby Drupal users group, I would say that's a great place to start. Oftentimes those local connections are a great way to sort of be able to enlist some help. In Drupal Slack, there's also this module development channel that you can use, in addition to sort of, some support and other related channels. Damien McKenna runs a contrib half hour that can be a good place to sort of, jump in and say, trying to get this work in my module and can't seem to, and maybe get some help with that. Obviously on the internet, there are a variety of kind of, online forums, Stack Exchange type sites where you can post questions. If you're going to go that route, I would say definitely be as specific as possible when you post your question. Maybe like include the actual code snippets and then the errors that you're getting. I would say the more general your questions are when you post them, the less likely you are to actually get any kind of a helpful response. And finally, if through any of these processes you manage to connect with somebody who seems like they're interested in collaborating, like absolutely jump in with both feet on that. Like even if it's making them a co-maintainer, because the value that somebody can bring of sort of like, as you go through that longer process of creating your module, understanding your goals for it and being able to offer constructive advice is really going to be invaluable. So you've written out a bunch of code. Hopefully you've got some things working. You're ready to start posting your code to Drupal.org. And so now's a good time to create your actual project listing on Drupal.org. I would say start by creating a sandbox project. I know they're technically deprecated, but I feel like particularly if it's your first time creating a project, you have complete flexibility to change all of the naming whenever you want. You can just delete it if you decide it was a bad idea. So it's a very flexible way to get started. And then you have the option, once you feel like it's ready to go out and share with the world, to actually promote that to a full project. And then the last thing is to make sure you include a README. And there's a link here to the README template as well. So now that you've got your project posted, the next thing is to think about what should be on the project page. So there is a link here to the official Drupal page in terms of what should go into that project page. I have noticed the last couple of times that I've created a new project that it now actually populates that description with kind of a template, which is a great step and makes it easy to sort of see what that intended structure looks like. But I would say let's go back to some of the things we've already talked about, right? So think about that, the problem that we were trying to solve with your module that we talked about really at the start. That should be the key element on your project page is communicate what's that problem that you're trying to solve. List out what those key features are, include things like screen captures. it's also often helpful to do things like list out, those similar modules that you found as part of your research stage. List out what those are and why the way your module approaches some of those same problems is a little bit different, so they understand, how to choose between them. And then oftentimes I like to try and make a fun little logo for the projects that I create, the modules. If you don't have sort of, the I guess skills to be able to do that, there may be people that that would be willing to help you out. There might be a local design school that would like to have students help you out with that. There's Fiverr and AI. So there's lots of ways to potentially get those logos, but it's certainly not a requirement. So now that all of that is posted, the next stage is really starting to tag releases. And what I would suggest is really start by trying to do a smaller number of things really well, as opposed to sort of try and do everything in sort of a rough, haphazard way. So by starting small, making things solid, people will start to get a good experience from using your module, and then you can add some of those features over time. Definitely the goal is to try and get to stable releases as quickly as possible. So don't be one of those maintainers that has something that's alpha 23 for 8 years. And so, yeah, you want to incrementally add those features over time, but you can get a set of features stable, maybe open an alpha release on the next set of features, and then work on those, start to collect some feedback, and so on. It's also a great opportunity to get some feedback in terms of people who are using your module. What are the things that they would love to see next? Because sometimes it might surprise you, the things that people are like, I love your module, it would be great if I could use it for this case, but I need, these two things and so on. And so oftentimes having that kind of a dialogue with your user base can be really, really valuable. So in terms of resources, I've got links here to the pages in the Drupal documentation around what the process is for creating a release, for understanding the alpha, beta, release candidate, and stable, and when you should use each of those. Semver.org to really understand that sort of semantic versioning, and then also what the process looks like to be able to opt into security coverage as well. So next, it's time to start to spread the word, to let people know in the community about your new and exciting modules. So the weekly drop can be a great place to start. Lots of people are using that in the community to sort of keep up to date in terms of what's new and exciting. I will say, particularly with brand new modules with low usage, and if it's a week where there's lots of things being released, you may not always get your module into the weekly drop. In my own experience, if you write a blog about it, you probably have a higher chance of getting your blog into the weekly drop than the actual sort of module release itself. So writing a blog is, I would say, definitely worth the effort. It also gives you a chance to sort of tell a long-form story around your module and, how it works. Whereas the project page you want to keep relatively succinct, in a blog you can sort of, tell the story about your module in kind of a, more verbose way. You could potentially have a video demo in there, different things that way. So as I say, I think a blog is definitely worth the effort. You may also want to look out if there are Slack channels that are sort of relevant to your project page. So in addition to sort of the module developers one, if let's say you've got a module that's about, an event calendar that you've built. So, there are a variety of different channels that are potentially related to events. And so start to participate in some of those discussions. And if you hear somebody talking about a problem that they're having that maybe aligns with what your module does, then that's a perfect opportunity to jump in and say hey, maybe you should try out this thing that I just made. And you're getting the word out about your module, but also in a way that's genuinely helpful. And to me, that's sort of the spirit of how you want to approach this. More generally, you can try to seek out people with a problem you started out to solve. So again, the event calendar example, maybe people that are in a local theater group or a local church group that organize events all the time, and you can at least put it in front of them and say, here's this thing I'm working on in a real world use case. What are the features that would make this better for you? Finally, do some presentations. Come to local Drupal users groups. Oftentimes they're starved for content, and so would love to have a new presenter come out, talk about something that they've been working on. Oftentimes they can give you some really valuable feedback, maybe give you some suggestions on ways that your project could be improved. Even Drupal camps, I would say, probably you want to start with sort of smaller regional camps and then maybe work your way up to some of the bigger camps. And also there's a thing called the Talking Drupal podcast that does a module of the week, and you can definitely get your module nominated for that as well. So finally, maintainership is definitely a critical element. So, I sort of think about it as kind of like the golden rule, trying to be the maintainer that you wish all modules have. Try and be responsive, particularly if people are filing a bug report, like I installed your module for the first time and I got a white screen of death. Those are the kinds of ones that you want to sort of like at least jump in and triage and say like, make sure you understand the steps to reproduce. If it is something that's like potentially widespread, then that's definitely something that you want to prioritize. But if it's some weird edge case, at least what I like to do is try and at least make sure that even if I can't sit down and solve the issue today, that at least I have all of the information so that if a week from now I decide I'm going to sit down and work on that issue, I understand how to reproduce it, maybe even a rough idea of what the problem is. Again, make releases on a regular basis. Personally, I'm not a fan of like trying to wait until there's like 80 issues resolved before I cut a release, because then if somebody says, oh, I just installed the new update and, my site is completely broken, now there's, a lot of potential causes for that. Whereas if you're sort of incrementally creating releases on a regular basis, there's probably a smaller number of issues that are potentially the culprit there. Writing documentation, I think, as a maintainer is definitely really, really valuable, because you give people the opportunity to sort of self-service and solve their own problem without having to sort of create that support request. Sometimes I've even, written out as part of an issue, the sort of like long form, like here's exactly how to solve your problem, and then been like, I should just drop that into a documentation page so that the next person doesn't have to sort of go through the same thing. And then finally, collaborate. Like if somebody says it would be great if your module worked with module XYZ, and you're like, yeah, that would be pretty interesting. Go into that issue queue, see if there's already an issue about getting the modules to work together, and if not, open one up and say, hey, is there an opportunity to get our modules working together, and maybe start that discussion with the maintainer. In terms of maintaining modules, like I actually really enjoy working on contrib modules. I feel like oftentimes in sort of like a corporate atmosphere, we end up having to, implement features, which features are going to get implemented and how are really dictated by basically the customer who signs the check. Whereas when you work on contrib modules, you sort of get to be that decision maker. You get to say, I want to implement this feature, so I'm just going to sit down and spend some time, hack out a first version of that. Or, somebody might open a feature request and say, I want the module to do, this cool new thing, and you might say, nah, that's not a thing I'm interested in supporting. And so you sort of get to be that gatekeeper and really make those decisions. It's also an opportunity to follow your passion, right? So you can work on, modules in areas that are exciting to you. So, if AI is the thing that you're excited about right now, then maybe either contribute to one of the existing modules or maybe start one of your own, because you have this idea of how AI could work with Drupal that nobody else has thought of before. And finally, it's a great learning experience. We talked at the start about some of the certifications that I have, and I definitely believe that if I hadn't worked on contrib modules as much as I have, that I wouldn't have been able to get all of those different certifications. It's definitely been a really solid learning experience for me in terms of really having a deeper understanding of, some of the core Drupal concepts as well. All right, I'm gonna just pause and take a quick drink. All right. So, wanted to quickly talk about sort of an example of some of these principles, basically with a module called Smart Date that I launched back in 2019, and how using some of these approaches helped it get from basically a sandbox module to one of the 500 most used modules on Drupal.org in less than 2 years. So it actually started with an idea that I had way back in 2009. I was working on kind of an events website, and it kind of was surprising to me how tedious it was to create event listings on Drupal, because it was all like, you had to populate every field in the date and then every field in the time, and then do all of that for both the start and the end. And then, so I was trying to compare that with sort of the experience of doing similar work in like, Google Calendar or something like that. And I realized that there were a couple of things, like sort of this duration concept, defaulting to time exactly on the next hour, that made it much easier in Google. And so I sort of thought like it'd be great if we could bring some of that same experience to Drupal, but never really got around to it until almost 10 years later. And so I decided to create this module in early 2019 and did some research on existing solutions, found a couple and reached out to the maintainers, didn't really get much of a response. There are some in hindsight that I wish I had found as part of that research, but had some really interesting discussions with some of those maintainers later on. But ultimately, I decided that there was a need for a module for that editor experience, also to address some performance issues I had seen with storing dates and times as strings, and then finally to provide kind of more intelligent formatting for date and time ranges. So the module was originally created as a sandbox on April 3rd of 2019. It was originally called Timestamp Ranges. But then as I sort of, crystallized, I guess you would say, the concept for what I wanted the module to do, I eventually settled on Smart Date as the project name, made it a full project on April 18th, and then on April 19th, the next day, gave it its first Alpha 1 release. A couple of weeks later, a Beta 1 release, and then a few iterations until I had a Beta 6 release that I felt like was kind of mature enough that it was ready to start to share with the world. So wrote a blog, managed to get that into the weekly drop, and then through that summer kept working at it. A big blocker was around having the output configuration and making that translatable. Eventually decided to use custom config entities as a way to make those translatable, and that helped me get it out to where I was happy with a 1.0 release, which happened in July 11th of that year. The next day, having a blog again managed to get that in the weekly drop about having it as stable then, and so continue to kind of iterate. Also going to presentations. So there's up where I live in Canada, there's a Waterloo, a regional Drupal users group. And so gave a presentation there. Went a little bit quiet, was sort of doing maintenance. The next big fix big feature that I wanted to do was around recurring dates. Had kind of hoped that I'd be able to do that more with integration with an existing solution like Date Recur, but it didn't seem like there was interest. So in 2020, the 2.0 release of Smart Date featured recurring dates and time zone support as sort of the big new feature. So again, the next day, managed to get a blog out and to really sort of try and share what some of those new features were. Probably the next feature that's notable is full calendar view support, so interactive calendar support. And then the 3.0 release in that summer was around having support for core date fields. So with a core date field, obviously you can't do all of the same things as a dedicated Smart Date field, but being able to use like the widget and the formatter seemed like a good way to sort of, make it applicable to a broader set of use cases. Now, that also obviously was the year when COVID hit and everything went virtual. And to me, that actually became kind of an opportunity, because there were lots of camps that in a normal year I wouldn't necessarily always be able to get to. But because they were virtual, I could submit sessions and got a few accepted. And so was able to give some presentations and some demos around Smart Date, the process of getting it set up and so on. So, continued on with different presentations, with blogs, some additional feature releases to sort of add kind of additional refinements to some of those like recurring date capabilities. Wrong direction. All right. And then in 2021, continue on, did a presentation for New York Drupal users group. Did a little bit of an incremental release just before I did a DrupalCon presentation on April 16th. and then later that year had additional feature releases. Probably the biggest thing was adding support for Date Augmenter API as kind of more of a, I would say, like a community-driven way of trying to extend the capabilities so that it wasn't just for Smart Date, but theoretically other sort of date formatters could leverage some of these additional capabilities as well. So what are some of the reasons why I think Smart Date kind of got that traction, was able to take off? So certainly I did some investigation early on to talk to other developers and understand the common set of problems, and really tried to deliver on those. In addition to listening to feedback from users all the way through. Also really tried to extend core code wherever possible. So as an example, looking at it early on, core date fields store dates and times as strings. I was seeing some performance issues with that. I felt like storing as sort of like native date time would have probably been the best solution, but like completely custom from a storage standpoint. Whereas timestamps are something that core uses, and so by leveraging the code that's already in core around using timestamps, I was able to get a solution that I was happy with, but like from a practical standpoint, made it much easier to actually get something implemented and sort of in the hands of users. Ultimately, I ended up sort of providing both tools and solutions. So modern versions of Smart Date have, some services that you can leverage if you wanted to use them in ways that aren't necessarily specific to like Smart Date as a field. But there are also these like Smart Date Starter Kit and Smart Date Calendar Kit, so that somebody wanting to use these things doesn't have to go through this complicated process of getting it set up. They can basically install one of these modules, and they've got a content type, views, and potentially some other functionality there as well. There's also been some amazing community contributions. So a couple that come to mind are there's a user who submitted basically a patch to provide migration from dates or Drupal 7 date fields, and then another one was with the calendar support to have like drag and drop support so that you can reschedule elements directly within the calendar. Again, really tried to make maintainership a focus, and again, making that more of a dialogue and listening to what users were saying they really needed from the module. Also, as you could tell, was very active in terms of trying to make sure that blogs were created to sort of communicate what are the big new features as they get released. Being diligent, I guess, in terms of making sure that all of that information was submitted to things like the weekly drop, and then also doing presentations and trying to make sure that constantly trying to get in front of new folks and spreading the gospel there. So in terms of additional resources, I've got DrupalEyes.me has a module development guide. I think actually most of those are not free. Also, Drupal Easy has a module development course, so you can definitely look at that as well. There's a documentation page on Drupal.org about managing a Drupal project, as well as about maintainership. Drupal MRN is actually a great tool that Matt Glayman has made. Basically, we'll use your Git history to automatically create for you the release notes with sort of all of the details around which issues are in there. Basically, all you have to do is rewrite the description, or I guess write the description, and it'll have all of like the links to the issues and the contributors and all of that good stuff. There's a blog post in here about why you really need to have a stable release, and I would also say like a stable release with again, security coverage is really what you should be aiming for. There is, in addition to sort of the other Slack channels that we've talked about, a maintainers Slack channel, so that may be useful to you as well. There is a maintainer support project, so beyond that contrib half hour that we talked about and some of the other resources, if you want to have sort of a more long-form conversation around something you're struggling with, that can be a good resource as well. And finally, there was a talk earlier today about why module builders should be in your developer toolkit. If you didn't get a chance to watch that, it's definitely something that has potential to be potentially even easier than some of those Drush tools in terms of helping you to build out that module. And so, once the recording is posted to YouTube, I would say definitely check that out. So that's really the material that I brought to talk about. Again, the slides are posted as Manclu on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Mastodon. But definitely happy to answer any questions if folks have those at this time.
Oh no. That's why people should sit in the front. You were first.
Sorry to make you run. Thank you for your talk. My question is, because I have a marketing background and no software development background at all. So the feedback is kind of annoying. How do you connect people that are working on their modules, or what are ways to connect software developers working on a feature or module with people like me in order to kind of join forces and make the best out of the release, blog article, pitch presentation, whatever? So like, how do you get people like me hooked up with maintainers and module builders?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I would say theoretically, you could go into a Slack channel like the module developers and say, hey, I come from this marketing background, would glad to be working with anybody who has a module that they're looking to sort of, get visibility on and talk about some of the capabilities that you bring as a marketer. The other thing too is if there are again, certain areas that you're really interested in. So, again, it's like, for me, it's like search or events or, some of those kinds of things. If it's more topic-based that you're interested in getting involved in, go into those channels and then sort of, see what some of the dialogues are. You can probably tell pretty quickly, who are the people who are pretty active in the space. And then you can maybe reach out to them and say hey, we can see that this thing you're working on, very actively maintained and all those things. If you'd want any help in terms of, helping to get more visibility and some of those other kinds of things, would love to work with you. I guess to me, those are the things that come to mind. But I mean, the other thing too is, again, if you go to a local Drupal user group, there may be conversations in there where you could start talking to developers there as well. Yeah, for sure.
So first of all, thank you very much. It was very It was very intensive and useful, and I actually sorry for the noises. I actually have two hopefully simple questions. You mentioned that before you started to work on the module, you talked with other developers about the idea, so you know that it would be actually useful for other people other than you. So I would like to ask, how did you do the talk with the others actually? Because we have a Slack and perhaps other means of communication. So that's the first one. And the second one is actually about time management. Do you have any time scheduled for work on the contrib in your life or something like that? That's a very interesting issue for me. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So let me try and take those in order then. So in terms of those discussions, at the time I was working at a sizable Drupal agency, and so there were just other developers that I knew that I could just sort of casually say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this thing, and we could sort of have a interactive in-person conversation, but also had gone into I think it was the Date Time Slack channel because it was event related, and said, hey, I've been thinking about doing this, and then other developers jumped in and were like, yeah, I've definitely had that same problem. And so, just was able to have it through Slack that way. I think even around the same time, I had been at a different local Drupal users group session delivering a talk about something else, and then afterwards had just been having sort of, over beers a conversation with the developer and sort of, got some validation that way. So I don't feel like there's probably one answer. A lot will depend on sort of like, what networks you have available, but, I would say, yeah, just try and reach out to whatever spaces feel like they're conducive to those kinds of conversations, I guess. Maybe, this kind of an event is perfect for that, right? In terms of time management, so I feel like, unlike a number of the other developers that I've talked to at this conference, I have the benefit that now my kids are old enough that like, they don't like wake up at 5 a.m. and like jump on the bed and want to play and stuff. My son is 15, so he wants to sleep until 2 because he's been playing video games until 4 in the morning. So it gives me a lot of time in the morning to just be able to work on things that I find interesting. I do still sometimes wake up and just like want to play video games for 3 hours, but oftentimes I find like I'll do a little like casual gaming or something, and I just feel like I could do something frivolous and just like know that the whole morning will go and then I've got nothing to show for it, or I could like actually work on a module and then do something that feels like it's helpful to people, and to me that feels like a better use of my time. So I don't really have a hard and fast rule. I've definitely known people who will say, I'm going to schedule like an hour and a half every night, or do certain things. If finding the time is a challenge, then adding that structure may be a good solution for you. Like for myself, I haven't really needed it, but yeah, I would say, again, there's probably no one solution for that. All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, then I think I can give folks 4 minutes back. So thank you all.